Thank you. Thanks for that introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here. So
Yeah.
with that, let me kick off by doing a screen share, if you don't mind, and step up here, take a look at that one, and share. Oops. And then go in here. So like that. So hi, I'm Dave McAllister, as was mentioned. I work for a company called nginx, a very popular open source project. Was first originally launched in about 2004. It's a web server. It powers a lot of the world's internet. But one of the things I wanted to talk a bit is sort of over time, how our approach to understanding how capable our projects are has changed. Background wise, I like Jim Jag earlier, I started with this long before it ever got called open source. Started with Linux version 0.9.3 and then have continued on in this space for a great deal of time. I've been parts of a lot of different projects. I've just started companies, but I'm currently working for nginx, helping to get the word out around all of the open source activities that help power our internet and where innovations come from. So with that, let's start talking about some of the things that happen. Open source is really cool. It's innovative. It's exciting. It's available. You're here at this conference to learn about these things. But there are also some of the other pieces that come into play. So open source projects are often driven by this need to sort of scratch a software itch. There are things that we need to solve problems for, but those problems may not make them ready for prime time. They may not be, especially in your applications going into a production, a scaled environment, they may not fully meet your needs. We also have to look at the impact that we can have about competing projects. Which ones are more fitting to our project space? Which ones have a more long-term view? Because we're going to be continuing to use these in the future for that. This is where maturity models start coming into play here. They help you understand that impact that when we go forward in our projects from different dimensions. We can look at stability, we'll look at activity, and we'll look at support. Most of you know that adoption for a project, especially for an end user, is more than a question of functionality and features. It includes those other things. It includes upgrade paths, packaging paths, and even training paths. But the real question comes down to something pretty simple. Does the technology or project fit your needs? And we're going to cover this a little bit around what are those potential needs. Well, interestingly, the potential needs themselves can also change based on where you are in your process. Most of y'all are familiar with Crossing the Chasm, the Geoffrey Moore functionality, which talks about sort of two classes of technology users. And the first one is the early adopters. And these guys, they like being on that cutting edge, that bleeding edge here. They're willing to not worry about things like documentation because they'll go figure it out themselves. And they mostly are capable of supporting their own. They really don't care whether there's a lot of commercial support or a lot of hardening of this code here. And honestly, to them, clunky can be charming because it can be kind of cool to be able to do something that's out there on the edge here. Pragmatists, which are people who are in the business for the business. They want more mature products. They want projects that they can put in place and immediately, basically type install and be up and running here. They want full functionality. They don't want things that say they're going to work and then don't work. So they want to make sure that all the feature sets are capable there, and they want them to be easy to use. Full support. So, in the older days, we used to talk about one of the problems with open source was there wasn't one throat to choke. This is one of them where people want to be able to call and know that someone is going to be responsible for helping them through a problem or issue here. And honestly, they really do want documentation. They want to understand documentation, not just from what the code says, but things like how to get started, what can I do with this, and as well as what configuration tools, and how do I resolve problems when they arise here? In many ways, using open source is kind of like being a general contractor. As the user, you can be your own general contractor. You can find all your subcontractors and supply all of those pieces here. Or you can hire somebody who already has all of that on tap and bring them in here. When we look at this, when we look at roughly about 100,000 or so open source projects, we might find two that meet this pragmatist requirement. So your problem is to judge between where you need to be as well as where the world is at any given moment. So maturity models help us here. And maturity models go all the way back to Maslow's work on the hierarchy of human needs back in 1943. He identified the phases that human motivations go through. If you're interested at all in gamifications, you've already seen this. If not, take a look at it. It's pretty fascinating. But think of it this way. A maturity model is a simple way to frame a complex subject here. The original one was probably the Software Engineering Institute's capability maturity model in 1993. That framework was originally meant to be a tool for the US Department of Defense to evaluate government contractors. But then we started looking at this and applying it to code, particularly in the open source sense. And as you can see, starting 2003, they became very popular. Open source maturity models, Capgemini, Navica, on down. And about 2010, they kind of sort of fell out of favor because everybody said, oh yeah, well, open source code is perfectly mature and never going to have a problem going forward in the future. Fast forward a decade. And we now know that the world of open source has changed the same way that our overall software engineering environments have changed. We now have active containers under orchestration. We have public and private clouds. We have elastic and ephemeral behaviors inside of here. So when we look at this, we now need to be able to adjust two things, not just the technology and maturity the project brings, but also the community that the project and the environments into which it works in. So let's start by taking a look at some of the common elements that make up these. So maturity models should attempt to do two things. They should describe a current state, where things are today, as well as what your desired state is, where things you would like to see happen here. And they can cover a lot of different categories, but most normally we look at things like functionality and people. So where this one is broken down. In the early days, most of the maturity models did not consider the impact of people, the culture, the contributors of the community in working with maturity models. So functionality, does it do what I need it to do? Has it been tested? Do I have quality assurance inside of this? Is there a risk assessment using this? Does it cause me more risk or less risk inside of this? And then finally, simply, can I even use this? Or am I going to spend so much time circulating through what's going on that I don't have the ability to make a lot of use of this? So there are multiple sets inside of this, but there's a big thing that those pieces don't consider. And that's what the culture and leadership of a project is and where the talent pool that you're going to tap is coming from. There's also additionally support for momentum, how popular a project can be. It's got risk because if it's popular, it may be able to continue on to the future. Perfect example of something like is Kubernetes for this. Also, though, does it support standards so that you aren't necessarily being locked into a single project approach in the future, but you have the ability to adapt to whatever the correct project for your functionality is. So when we start breaking it down here, there are three assessments that get made inside of that larger picture of functionality and people here. First one is, what are your product elements? And that really comes down to things, what matters to you? Is it speed and performance? Is it scalability? Is it the ability to see where things are going and maybe even influence that updates and roadmaps model? The second one that comes into place is, what are your weighting factors? So each piece needs to have where it lives in importance to your desired state. So think back to this original one that says performance. Perhaps for me, performance is the most important element. I want transactions to go screaming through the piece of software and get handled correctly. And I don't want to ever have to worry about a slowdown based on workloads that are coming in here. I want it to be able to handle all of those pieces inside of that. In that case, your weighting factor is going to be much higher than something along the lines that comes back and says, oh, well, is it a beautiful user interface that my end user sitting at a desk could use when really the software that you're using is all back-end based and the end user will actually never see it? In that case, your weighting factor would be very low, potentially even zero for that. When you put those together, You need to look at that importance of those pieces here. The second thing that's important is how much do I need the outside help, outside assistance? Can I build this myself? Can I answer questions? Can my team make the changes with that? Am I okay with just adopting a project as one of those pieces here? And then the last sort of pieces come into play here is, will it be here next year? We've seen projects that seemed really, really popular, really positive directions. And then 2 or 3 years later, there's not a lot of people supporting them. There's not a lot of activity inside of them, and they're no longer growing or expanding. So keep those things inside of that. There's also a trend category. People tend to go to places they get a lot of interest and a lot of attention. And yet, generally speaking, that's because it's useful, but not always. Sometimes it's just hot because it's hot. And it may take a couple of years. Flashing back, iSCSI, if you remember iSCSI, it was a very hot topic in the early 2000s, but it really didn't come into existence until the late 2000, 2008, 2010 timeframe. And so you may have jumped on the boat because it was hot in 2002, but you wouldn't have received the benefit until 2010. So when you start looking at this, you want to look at what the model is telling you about what is important to you, not where the product is now. So keep in mind that that desired state is actually more important for your setup capabilities than the measurement state of where a project is right now. And then finally, you really want to just sort of figure it out. How do you roll this down to the metric? We all like numbers in a sense. And so when you look at this, there's two sets. There's an item score. That is, each item in your list has a weight and a rating. And basically, you can multiply the two together to come up with a number. There's a sectional score. In this case, we're working with functionality and people. And that score sums those item scores and divides it out by the number of item scores. We'll get in a little bit more into that when we look at the actual examples for here. And the final is simply sum of the two sectional scores. You can vary this. This is what works for me when I'm looking at projects that I want to adopt. It works for me when I'm looking at the projects I support as to where they are in a maturity basis. Sorry, it happens to be oak tree pollen season here, so I tend to choke up a little easier than normal. So first of all, let's look at this, the product factors. And the product factors can go on for a great length of time. These are the ones that I find most useful. You can add, you can subtract. Again, keep in mind that putting a zero weighting removes it from the process in a sense, but you can continue to add things here. One, when I'm looking at this from a maturity basis, for something I want to adopt into a production class environment for here, I want to know that it's packaged correctly. I don't want to have to go build all the pieces myself and try to make all that subcontracting decisions into play. I want to be able to build across all of these pieces here. I also want to know that once it's adopted, I personally am not responsible for training. I want to be able to look at something and come back and say, hey, go there and get training. And that can be training, for instance, again, we have a nginx JavaScript, which is a cool way of writing new configurations for the nginx open source project. You may not want to teach somebody about JavaScript. There's thousands of courses for this. But once you do this, you want to make sure it's there. You also want to look at other dependencies. Your project may or may not have dependencies on other projects. And so you want to look at what the dependency trail looks like so that you can also determine what the weak points in there. Recently, we've heard a lot about open source software supply chain security aspects. This is another aspect of that, which is not the security side, but the maturity and production capable side. Where are all the dependencies in that same category here? Finally, probably the place most people start, what's the functionality? Does the code work for you? Does the design work for you? And does the architecture actually fit into your needs and basis? Some of the ones that tend to not get thought about as much are testing practices. How the code is tested is actually important. And it would be useful if the open source project actually shares what it's testing, why it's testing, and what the results of that testing looks like. Also, documentation. I can give you great examples of documentation, but I can also give you the most nightmarish documentation you've ever seen in your life. But the project thought it was great because they already knew all of the ins and outs of the project. And so their documentation really became reminders for how things worked, not explanations or detailed directions for how things work. And then finally, depending on the category, it is quite often defined that open source projects do not pay a lot of attention to the usability, particularly if it touches the end user. This can be problematic. And use an example. There's a wonderful open source project called GIMP, GNU Image Manipulation Package Process Product. I've forgotten which it is now for this, but it also competes against a proprietary product, Adobe Photoshop, for this, which is more successful. Neither one have the best UI in the world, but one of them has a UI that most of the people in the commercial space understands. Maturity, they're both equally mature, but usability varies drastically between those two products. Excuse me. And when you start looking at this, it's rather interesting when we look at the people side. The people side is probably something that these days has more and more impact on where we are in our open source adoption process. So let's start with breaking these down. Momentum. Momentum is how much is that project taking on, in a sense, running the world or ruling the world. There's several great talks. Open source is eating software. Open source is eating the world. And that's true in a sense because it's momentum. We have values. We receive value for each of those pieces inside of here. We also need to look at, does it support standards? Do we have to change the way we do business, or would we in the future have to change the way we do business should something untoward happen with the project? You have license types and conflicts, and there was a talk earlier that talked a little bit about sort of this intellectual property and licensing structures, rather than going back through this. But there's a big difference between bringing in something that is a copyleft license into your active production environment versus bringing in something that's a more permissive or academic style license into that same production. Today, we look also at corporate commitment. It's very true that there are successful open source projects that are really done by one or two people. But today, we see more and more corporations playing a role into the world of open source. Looking at the Cloud Native Computing Foundation's Open Telemetry project, the list of companies, I think the last time I looked at it was nearly 800 companies have contributed to that project. Companies like Google, like Microsoft, like Splunk are major contributors and drivers of this product set. You need to make the decision of whether or not that makes sense for your environment. Generally speaking, I tend to like it when I see multiple corporations actively supporting a project, not a single corporation supporting a project, because then I know that the corporations are going to be bounded by the general good, and they're going to be making sure that everything works for everybody without having the risk of suddenly somebody going away or somebody changing a license, and all of a sudden, what was now open may not be. Corporate commitment is both easy to track and hard to track, depending on where the project lives. It is very seldom you see a walled garden approach for a multi-company project. They tend to be more in foundations. There's also a leadership and culture environment. So when we're working at this, we don't need to know who necessarily the leadership is, but we need to know how the leadership is developed. We heard a talk earlier about sort of the merit aspects. How do you determine the right people to do code reviews or code merges? So what's the leadership approach? And this needs to be broken out as well. Also, community maturity. Is this brand new community, never existed before, and everybody's still trying to figure out what's going on. That community vitality. How active is the community? Is it one or two people, or is it lots of people contributing and giving ideas here? And then finally, the talent pool. How do you find people that make sense and bring into that environment? So let's look at this. So you've now seen a series of requirements. You can define your own requirements. You can change the requirements. You then have to locate resources, define on the availability of that, and then assign a score. The first one and the last one are probably the easiest two inside of these two. Locating resources can actually be quite a challenge depending on where you look for and what type of project you're looking at. So you can go out to GitHub, click on the Insights button, and get an understanding of how the code has adapted over time. You can go out to devstats.cncf.io and get a look at the type of activities and corporate environments. But for instance, you can't necessarily go to an Apache Software Foundation project and look at corporate involvement. It doesn't exist that way. There are individuals that are listed there, but you would have to backtrack to see what things are going on. You can then look at your third-party sites, your Reddits, your Stack Overflows, and see what the community sets of questions look like. So gathering and locating these resources and deciding on the answers to each of these questions becomes more of a challenge over time. Actually, the longer a project has existed, quite often, the easier it is to find material, but finding material that is necessarily up to date can be more of a challenge. And finally, you get to pick what score, and the score is very, very arbitrary. There's rules that you can put in place here, and there are some automated open source maturity models, but they tend to need to have sort of the human insight on what you feel is important and what you feel is necessary. Oops. So weighting factors, what are your required factors? And then how important are they? And this part is completely project dependent on your side, not on their side, on your side. So what I've done is I'm gonna take one, this is an nginx unit. Nginx unit's a data plane, polyglot, application server, reverse proxy, yada, yada, yada. Its repository is out on Mercurial. That's nginx.com. And it has some interesting aspects when we start looking at this from a maturity basis. The project actually was released, I think, in 2017. First of all, I did this maturity model before I worked here. So keep in mind that this is not from an inside view. This is literally from an outside view of what's going on. And as you can see, when we have this, we have a number of different pieces that are important that are inside of here. Functionality. The thing does what it says it does. And it's pretty important from my viewpoint. If I have an app server, I really want the app server to do what it says it's going to do for me. So it has a high ranking. I'm using a weighting of 1 to 5 here. I'm using a rating of 1 to 5, a weight of 1 to 5. And then my score is the two that are there together. I've added this thing I call power ranking, just to make it more visual for me, is anything that crosses an 80% boundary of the overall score to the maximum possible score gets green highlighted. Anything that drops below a certain level has the opposite. It flashes to red here. So functionality, right on. Testing practices. Well, testing is kind of important from my viewpoint, but there are no clearly defined testing processes. If you dig into the repositories out on Mercurial, you will find there are a number of commits made that talk about adding a testing process, a specific testing process, or modifying a testing process, or modifying the way that we approach a testing process. So yes, they are testing, but I can't tell you how. I can't tell you what the results of that testing are. And so it gets a lower score. It is being tested, but what its overall outcome looks like is sort of, anybody's guess inside of that. Usability. Again, it does what it says it does. And this is one where We'll touch on this a little bit when we hit the standards piece. Not only does it do that, it actually follows the best practices. Remember, this is a multilingual approach to life. It follows the practices that are necessary for each language of choice. And so it actually does have incredibly good usability. This is a product that your end user sitting at the desktop will never see. It's a product that fits for devs and for DevOps, the SRE side of the house. And so the usability approach is a little different than if I'm expecting somebody to be looking at pretty screens for that. Support, it's only commercial support. That may or may not be really important to me. I've got it slightly weighted onto a little bit on the sort of middle side, but I'd really like to be able to go ask questions without necessarily having to pay for it as well. Documentation, great docs, really great docs. But docs need continual extensions. We need to constantly be updating where our documentation is. And that's not necessarily showing up the same way from the outside world. Packaging. Yes, packaging is really, really good. It may not be as important to me because it is a back-end tool in some senses here, but you can pretty much, go out, grab the package and have it up and running in moments. Maybe not quite that fast, but moments inside of that. Is there training availability? Not really. There is a book, an O'Reilly book on looking at unit, nginx unit cookbook, but it's from about 2018. So it's not been updated as they've updated the project as well. Integration, dependencies, you can see all this. But now let's talk about community, the leadership side. Obviously, there's a leader inside of here. nginx is massively well known, and it's got very strong capabilities here. But there's not really a developer community. There is a very active user community, but nginx drives everything. And it becomes almost that walled garden approach in some ways. You can submit things, but they go into nginx and get handled differently than a standard GitHub PR. So keep that in mind. Community maturity, not great. It probably needs to be a little more important than it is. But again, there's not really an end user focus to this project. And so the community may not have the same impact as necessary for that. Likewise, community vitality. People that are using this project are very supportive of this project, but there's not a lot of people discovering this project. And that becomes a major consideration. So not necessarily the pool is growing. If it is, it's growing slowly. Likewise, talent pool, hiring, no. Go out and look for somebody who's got nginx unit experience and you're going to have a hard time finding them. And so the talent pool is really down, especially if you wanted somebody that was going to actually help, contribute and maintain code for that. End user support, pretty much through the third-party environments, Reddit, Stack Overflow, other places for this. But in my category, that's actually a very low weighting because I don't care about the end user environment. Even counting the end users as my SRE pools, it's still a very different model inside of here. And then momentum, it's actually pretty incredible how fast this is growing from 2017, where it came into being. And you can see a pretty steady ramp of people coming in and going, I actually have the problem that this solves. And then finally here, this momentum for standards. Not only does it standardize for the languages, but it's standardized for the inputs and the way that it does structures. And so it's not a piece that's simply something built. It's actually looking at this and saying, this is how people make use of this. And so it actually gets a pretty decent rating for standards work, as well as in my category, I think is actually pretty important that it goes forward. And so you can look at this. Sectional score for the top section was almost 11. Sectional score for the bottom was around 8. My final score was a little over 19. Doing this today, these numbers would change. These numbers were done about 6 months ago. Doing these, my numbers would now probably change a little bit. But this is based completely on just looking at what I could see from the outside world with an understanding of what was important from my viewpoint for an app server. Okay, so what's the real catch around this? Maturity models are really great, but they oversimplify reality. Every one of us has a different problem that we're trying to solve here. But what they're trying to do is take a really complex picture and put it into something that gives us a concrete, measurable result that we can then compare results against each other and make decisions. So looking at a project, open tracing versus open census versus open telemetry, we may, nowadays it's only open telemetry, but we worry about. But if you looked at it from that viewpoint, you may want to look at the maturity of 3 different categories trying to solve the same class of problems and figure out what's the best approach for you. An open maturity model will give you the ability to measure that in concrete ways. Maturity models also assume that there's only one true path. Now, that's seldom the characteristics of what happened. There's lots of ways of solving problems. With open source, though, that defined path can allow us to learn from what has gone on before. And so we can look at maturity models as a way of expanding our understanding and expanding the nature of what we want to choose. So, and finally, maturity models actually assume that there is a desired perfect state of nirvana inside of here. As we all know, software never ends. Software continually grows. And so we are constantly looking at ways that we can change things and adapt things and change to the existing world in new and unique ways. So that structure gives you not necessarily a nirvana, but it gives you a very good indication of what the current state is. The nirvana you're defining is based on your desired state. That's where your weighting comes into play here. So again, think of it as not giving you a nirvana state, but giving you the pathway to your desired results. And so when you look at this, an open source maturity model can give you a framework for comparison. It allows you to compare projects with a more or less even playing field across them, to look at the functionality, look at the capabilities, and look at the community behind it here. One of the things that I find useful is that I use the maturity model against projects that I'm involved in, because I have a reasonable understanding that once I want people to adopt this into production, I want them to feel comfortable that it's going to meet their production characteristics, scalable, hardened, secure, all those different pieces into play here. But there is no silver maturity bullet. Nobody is going to come back and say, oh, the model said it was perfect and therefore it must be perfect, make it work. Whereas a model is a comparison tool to give you a point in time snapshot of what it looks like to your project here. And finally, to bring this up here, a tool is only used as well used when it's used appropriately. So don't expect the maturity models to magically give you the product you want. Use maturity modules to give you the project you need. And with that, let me thank you for listening. Once again, I'm Dave McAllister. You can find me on LinkedIn at Dave Mac, on GitHub, Twitter, or almost anything else as DW McAllister. And with that, let's see if there are any questions that are showing up here. It seems very quiet. So that's always the fun of being the last presentation of the day as well. So.
Yeah, it was a wonderful presentation, Dave. We will wait for a few minutes for some questions to pop up in the chat or Q&A.
Sure. Yeah, there's some interesting aspects, and I mentioned a couple of them, but I tend to live when I'm doing this. It depends on where the project is. If it's in a foundation, I start with the foundation for that. And if it's not, I'll go out and find where its repository is, GitHub, GitLab, and so forth. And yeah, looking at the third-party sites, the Stack Overflows and the Reddits of the world, interesting enough, if you go out to them, you can actually break it down into categories, especially for subgroups, subreddits, and so forth, and look at the activity across time, how many questions getting asked and answered. So, and as an open source geek for nginx, we actually do track this. We know what questions are being asked and what questions are being answered. We know how many are being answered by our community, which to us is a strong maturity message. So for that, but yes, as it was pointed out, watch out for those surprise groups that suddenly show up on Stack Overflow and disrupt everything known to mankind.
Yeah, that was great. I have one question for you. So you were presenting it from both views. One view is that you use this model to see how your project fares in the other ecosystem, and the second one is from a user perspective, where you see as an outsider and see how different projects fare. So in which aspect do you find it more useful or more interesting?
Believe it or not, it's actually more interesting when I'm trying to adopt a new project in, because there are so many projects that do similar things. And so I'm on these people. I love to go look and see what everybody is. I have a cat that's been running around screaming at my feet. If y'all, hopefully the mic didn't pick her up, but I want to know everything that's going on. And so I want to go look at, and I remember, I was in open tracing, and then I looked at open census, and then open telemetry came along. And so looking at the maturity across those three was fascinating, absolutely fascinating. So the nice thing is, from a viewpoint of trying to get somebody to adopt it, if I go out to Acme Anvil Corporation and talk about unit as an example, I want to be able to tell them, okay, this is where it's good, but also I'm an open source geek. This is where it's not as good as it could be. I'm not going to I'm not going to sugarcoat this. I'm going to tell you the good and the bad.
Yeah, correct. Also, so that was very interesting. So on the other aspect, when you think about using it from insider perspective, is there any interesting experience that you want to share where like using this analysis made a big difference or a surprising difference, something like that?
Yeah, so using unit as an example, for instance, when I came on board and was talking to the unit program product manager, and so forth, and I sort of broke this out, and his statement, he immediately was going to start by doing a pushback. Oh, no, blah, blah, blah. And then he stopped and he thought about it. And he said, you're right. I think I can argue a point here, but we don't have a community. Our documentation is really, really pretty good, but it hasn't been updated in 12 months. And all of a sudden it made a difference for the way he approached releasing the next release of this open source project. And that was kind of a unique viewpoint from them. It also brought home that when you started looking at this, certain aspects were more mature than others. So this is a multilingual. I think it supports 7 or 8 languages here, but some languages are a lot easier than others to work with. And yeah. And so all of a sudden it was, okay, we need to make a choice. Do we focus on the languages where everybody's using it, or do we focus on the languages where we're weak? And that's an interesting functionality.
Okay, that's quite useful. Yeah, I think we have one comment in the chat from Lona, if you'd like to read it.
Yeah, so watch out for those surprise overflow groups. XZY sucks is a good example, unfortunately, for that. And you've got all sorts of things where you can find all these weird groups that have shown up that are other things. Looking at going out to Stack Overflow and typing in just nginx as a raw search, I think shows up 14 different communities in there, but 4 of them have nothing to do with nginx. It's fascinating for that. There is also sort of a interesting characteristic when you look at that, is that you have multiple types of communities. And so, for instance, things like Stack Overflow and Reddit tend to be focused on support communities. And so they're the people who are trying to figure out the configurations or why it doesn't work the way you want to, not necessarily the developer community who's going to be the innovators in that environment.
Okay.
Cool. Yeah, she's going to fill in all my things here. Yes, OSINT tools are actually kind of cool to work with inside of that. My biggest challenge right now is going to be getting the security supply chain software built into all these projects, and that will get added to this maturity model in its next rev. We'll be looking at the open source supply chain security. Cool.
Yeah. So one last question. I mean, this is also from my personal experience. So if a project is starting out and is not ready for, like, say, is not yet at the Chasm and is really looking for early adapters and has not gotten it yet, so do we also say we compromise on some of the aspects and we score, like we can use the open source model to say we are not going to focus on some aspects because we are in an early phase, and then we are going to focus only on, say, some aspects. So what do you think about that, like in the context of early projects?
That's actually a really interesting thought. I hadn't thought of it that way. So basically projects start and they look at a functionality item. They're trying to build a functionality space. But you're generally building it for somebody or something. You're building it for a problem space. And so it'd be really interesting to look at this. Can you imagine you built a whole brand new language and its runtime environment, and you didn't give anybody documentation on what the commands were? So you would focus on a documentation aspect with your language structure. If you're working with nginx as a web server reverse proxy, you really don't care whether you coded it or not, but you would probably really care about configuration guidelines. And so you may want to focus a little bit more onto that environment. The other one is looking at who it's going for. Nginx is designed for operations guys who are putting web servers in place and making them run, versus the architect in the back room who's trying to figure out how to make everything work together. So it would be interesting I'll have to think about that a little bit more, but it'd be interesting to break it down and say, can it help define directions for emerging projects? I have to look at that. Thank you. That's good.
Okay. Yeah, so that was a great talk, and it brings us to the end of the last session, but I think we have still 2 minutes. So if you would like to read the chat or say something more, feel free.
So I just want to sum up and thank people. This has been a great conference. It's kind of interesting seeing some people I've known for a long time, as well as learning some really cool new things. So my appreciation for ATO and Open Source 101 in doing that.